Sleep on the 19th-century American frontier was rarely a private or peaceful act. It was something negotiated each night between exhaustion, geography, insects, and whatever shelter happened to exist nearby. If you imagine the Wild West through films, the image is simple. A cowboy rolls out his bed beneath a clear sky. A small fire burns low. Horses stand quietly in the distance. The night feels calm, almost peaceful. But for many people living on the frontier, night did not bring rest. It brought another set of problems. Because in the real West, sleep was rarely comfortable, rarely private, and often interrupted by things that crawled, bit, or simply refused to let a person rest. Frontier life created what historians sometimes call a kind of sleeping economy. Where you slept depended almost entirely on where you worked, how much money you had, and how crowded the settlement had become. For ranch hands, that usually meant the bunkhouse. A bunkhouse was not a romantic log cabin where a handful of cowboys relaxed after long rides. It was a practical building designed to house as many workers as possible in the smallest amount of space. Inside, narrow wooden bunks were lined up against the walls. Straw-filled mattresses were common, often stuffed into rough cloth sacks that could be emptied and refilled when the contents wore down. The room itself served several purposes. Men slept there, they ate there, they repaired equipment there. In the evenings, stories and arguments filled the same air that would later carry the sounds of coughing, snoring, and restless turning. Privacy did not exist. What mattered was simply finding a place to lie down. Military life on the frontier was even more regimented. In army posts across the American West, enlisted soldiers slept in barracks rooms packed with bodies. Rows of bunks held 2 men each. A single room might house 24 soldiers. Their mattresses were often nothing more than ticking filled with straw or dried grass. Blankets were issued by the Army and carefully folded each morning. Clothing was rolled into makeshift pillows. Heat came from a stove placed somewhere in the room. At night, the warmth from the fire mixed with the heat of dozens of sleeping bodies. The air grew heavy. Ventilation was poor, and the smell of sweat, wool, and damp bedding lingered long after the lamps were extinguished. But soldiers were still fortunate compared with many civilians moving through frontier towns, because travelers often slept wherever there was space. Gold Rush diaries describe nights spent on floors, workbenches, and crowded boarding houses where strangers lay side by side without even knowing each other's names. One traveler wrote about waking during the night to feel rats running across his face. Another described sleeping on a wooden work table, wrapped in a blanket, while the room around him filled with the sounds of men shifting in cramped positions, trying to find rest on whatever surface they had been given. The frontier did not always provide beds. Sometimes it barely provided shelter. Even when a person did have a bed, the materials themselves were temporary. Mattresses were not manufactured objects as we know them today. They were sacks, cloth bags stuffed with straw, hay, or dried grass. Over time, the filling flattened, broke down, or gathered moisture. The sack might be emptied and refilled, but the bedding itself was rarely washed. A blanket might serve for months or years with little more than occasional airing in the sun. For cowboys on cattle drives, bedding was even simpler. Every rider carried what was known as a bedroll. It was usually a length of canvas wrapped around wool blankets and a few personal belongings. During the day, the roll might be strapped behind the saddle or stored on the chuck wagon. At night, it became the cowboy's entire sleeping arrangement. The bedroll was spread on the ground, sometimes beside a small fire, sometimes under nothing but open sky. In good weather, it was tolerable. In bad weather, it could become miserable. Rain soaked the ground. Wind cut through blankets. Cold settled into the earth beneath the sleeper. And even on clear nights, the ground itself rarely allowed uninterrupted rest. because the greatest enemy of sleep on the frontier was often invisible. Insects. Bedbugs were a constant presence in 19th-century bedding. Wherever mattresses were reused, where straw sacks were shared between occupants, or where buildings housed large numbers of people, the insects found ideal conditions. Historical accounts describe entire mattresses alive with them. One frontier woman recalled discovering that her first straw mattress in a new home was already filled with bedbugs. She later described launching what she called a war of extermination, using boiling water and kerosene to kill the insects hiding in the seams of the bed. Travelers encountered the same problem in mining camps and boarding houses. Diaries from the Gold Rush period describe sleepless nights spent scratching at bites, lifting blankets to discover clusters of insects hiding in the wood of the bunks. Some travelers tried pouring oil onto the bed frames. Others burned the insects with candle flames. But victory was temporary. The bugs returned as soon as the bedding was reused, and bedding was always reused. Clean sheets were rare luxuries on the frontier. Laundry required water, time, and equipment that many settlements simply did not have. As a result, clothing and bedding were often worn or used far longer than anyone would have preferred. Under those conditions, parasites were not unusual. They were expected. Lice thrived wherever people lived closely together without regular washing facilities. The insects hid in seams of clothing and moved easily between bodies in crowded rooms. In extreme situations, lice were more than an annoyance. They could carry diseases that spread rapidly in places where people slept in close contact. Crowded barracks rooms, bunkhouses filled with workers, and boarding houses packed with travelers all created conditions where illness could pass from one sleeper to another with alarming speed. Tuberculosis, a disease spread through the air when infected people coughed or spoke, became especially dangerous indoors. Poor ventilation and tightly packed sleeping arrangements meant the air itself could carry infection from one person to the next. But disease was only one of many things that disturbed sleep on the frontier. Travel itself could make rest nearly impossible. The stagecoach, one of the most important forms of transportation across the American West, was not designed with comfort in mind. Passengers sat shoulder to shoulder on narrow wooden seats. Space was limited. One traveler described receiving a ticket that effectively granted him 15 inches of seat space for the entire journey. That narrow section of bench became both chair and bed. Stagecoaches ran day and night across long routes. Passengers might remain seated for dozens of hours, stopping briefly at stations to change horses or eat quick meals before continuing. Sleep happened whenever exhaustion forced it. Bodies leaned against one another, legs became tangled in the cramped interior. Every bump in the road shook the passengers awake. Some travelers claimed the only relief came when the coach stopped long enough for them to stretch out on the ground beside the road. Even that brief moment of lying flat felt like luxury. The road itself made rest difficult. Stage routes crossed rough terrain, where wheels struck stones and ruts deep enough to throw passengers against the sides of the coach. One traveler later remarked that after such a journey he believed he finally understood what hell must feel like. Cattle drives created a different kind of sleep deprivation. In popular imagination, cowboys finish the day's work, roll out their bedrolls and rest beneath the stars while the herd sleeps quietly nearby. But the cattle themselves required constant supervision. Night herders rode slow circles around the resting animals, singing or calling softly to keep them calm. If the herd panicked, a stampede could begin in seconds. That meant someone always remained awake. Sleep for the men on the drive came in shifts. One group might lie down while another circled the cattle in darkness. Hours later, the roles reversed. No one enjoyed an uninterrupted night. The open range offered fresh air and space, but it did not offer security. Rainstorms soaked bedding. Cold winds swept across the plains. Animals wandered near camps. and the ground itself was rarely forgiving. Rocks, roots, and uneven soil pressed against the sleeper's body through layers of canvas and wool. Even the stars that appear so peaceful in paintings could become part of the problem, because a person lying awake on the open range had little protection from the long hours of darkness. In frontier towns, conditions could be just as uncomfortable. Hotels did exist in some places, especially in growing towns like Tombstone or Deadwood, but these establishments often struggled to meet demand. Rooms were shared, beds were shared. Travelers arriving late might find every bed already occupied. Some slept in chairs, others stretched out on floors, tables, or even the saloon counters once the night's drinking ended. Clean bedding was not guaranteed, and in many places, the mattress you slept on had already been used by dozens of previous occupants. Sometimes, the frontier offered moments of comfort. Certain boarding houses did provide clean beds and proper meals. Some travelers wrote about finally reaching a place where they could sleep without insects or crowding. But those moments stood out precisely because they were unusual. For most people, sleep on the frontier remained uncertain. The end of the day did not bring the quiet peace shown in films. It brought the struggle to rest in conditions shaped by limited resources, crowded spaces, and the simple realities of life on the edge of settlement. The romantic image of the cowboy lying peacefully beneath the stars hides something simpler and far less glamorous. Night on the frontier was not a time of calm reflection. It was a time when exhausted bodies tried to recover wherever they could, often surrounded by strangers, insects, and the constant awareness that comfort was temporary. In the real Wild West, sleep was not always rest. Often, it was just survival until morning.